And so today we're going to talk about twice exceptional gifted students. And today's going to be very different than what you usually hear, because I approach this in a very different way. For me, twice exceptional gifted students is really a combination of things that I've been doing for the last 40 years. I will talk about some of the tests and books and such that I've published. So just so you know, I have rating scales on executive function and social emotional, on autism, impairment, and then the tests, the Naglieri general ability test for screening, the NNAT, of course, which has been used for a long time, and then my neurocognitive assessment tools. So these are things that I've published over the years. When I worked as a school psychologist, as a 25-year-old, I felt uncomfortable with the way we measured intelligence. And since that time, it's become really clear to me that the intelligence tests that we have used, like the Binet or the Wexler or the Colgate or the Olsat, they're considered intelligence measures, and they've had a profound impact on, probably millions of students. But honestly, I don't think they're adequate for determining if a student has a disability as well as being gifted. And I've been researching how intelligence tests can be used to better understand a specific learning disability, how an intelligence test might be used to better understand ADHD, which is often considered or diagnosed on behaviors rather than cognition. And the same is true for children on the spectrum. We often identify them based upon their behaviors, but actually, cognitively, they have a cognitive profile that's distinctive, depending upon which tools you use to evaluate them. And that's really what today is about. I'm going to talk about a theory of intelligence called PASS, P-A-S-S. The theory is based on brain functioning. And when we think about intelligence as defined by the brain, then we can see things that we've never seen before on traditional intelligence tests. And we can make much better decisions about diagnosis as well as instruction and just general academic methodologies. So let's kind of walk through the different disabilities. We'll talk about specific learning disability, ADHD, and autism. So, as you know, specific learning disability is described as a disorder in one or more of basic psychological processes that essentially underlie acquisition of knowledge, underlie performance in school. Now, of course, these basic psychological processes were not defined by the federal government, but this is the definition that we've used for a long time. And of course, that's where dyslexia comes into the picture. And we'll talk about dyslexia very specifically. And of course, the key piece is that a student has had opportunities to learn. And that's, of course, very, very important. So when we talk about specific learning disability. Now, the specific word is really important. What we're talking about is academic weakness in a particular area, not in all areas. And to do that in a way that's consistent with the regs, I think we need to measure basic psychological processes. Now, if you look at research on dyslexia, for example, we know that the original ability achievement discrepancy method is not very helpful, to say the least. And there's a lot of research that shows that children with those kind of patterns, ability achievement discrepancies, don't have any kind of similar brain patterns, which is not surprising at all. And I think the whole approach of using an ability achievement discrepancy, so there's a discrepancy between a WISC and achievement, for example, to determine SLD, I think is clearly not supported by literature. So what alternatives might we have to traditional intelligence tests that could measure basic psychological processes as described in the law and could show different profiles? The neuropsychologist A.R. Luria wrote a critically important article that appeared in 1975 in Scientific American. I remember reading that paper in the 70s, and I was blown away by it. And what did Luria say? He said that there are 4 basic abilities. The first we call planning. That's the kind of thinking that a person uses whenever they have to figure out how to do something that they decide to do. So it's like executive function, or it's like metacognition, concepts like that. This is related to the front part of the brain. The next ability is attention. Attention is the thinking that you're using right now to focus on what you see and what you hear and resist distractions. The next is simultaneous processing. This is the thinking that we use when we have to understand how things go together. Visual, spatial kinds of tasks involve what we call simultaneous processing, but so do linguistic tasks like reading comprehension, where the question is, what's the best title for a paragraph or a story? You have to look at all the pieces together. And then successive processing is all about following a sequence, the thinking that you need to use to follow a sequence. So these kinds of abilities that Luria described form the PASS theory of intelligence that I've been writing about and researching many, many years. And they fit into the concept of, neuropsychology, neurocognitive, neurodiversity, whatever term you would like to use. But these 4 neurocognitive abilities provide us a definition of the disorder in one or more basic psychological processes. And they can be measured by the cognitive assessment system. So we're talking about 4 different abilities that relate to 4 different parts of the brain. And as I have shown here, these are 3 books that I've written on this. The one in the middle, that's a book of interventions, and the other 2 are practical and theoretical discussions. Now, to explain this a little bit more about thinking, we want to measure thinking. This progressive matrices is a really good example of a test that measures thinking. Let's examine it. In order to arrive at the answer, we need to look at these 2 and these 2 to figure out what goes there. Of course, the answer is easy, number 2. But we don't have to use any language to do that. Here's a task that has the same structure, but it does require some knowledge. Here's another task with the same structure that also demands knowledge. What's the answer to this one? Somebody just yell it out. 3 is to 9 is 4 is to
16.
12.
yes. Thank you. So you need to know about squares. Now I'm going to give you another one that I bet no one can answer, but you'll be able to understand it, but you won't be able to answer it. Are there any musicians in the audience? C7 chord leads to, as we say in music, to an F chord, and the E7 moves you to an A. But here's the point. As knowledge becomes more important, the question goes from measuring thinking to measuring knowing. And what we really want with a good measure of intelligence is to measure thinking. So let's look at these 4 processes a little bit more closely. Planning is a neurocognitive ability that we can measure by giving a student an environment that can be solved more efficiently if a person uses a strategy. Because when we talk about planning, we're talking about problem solving, using strategies. Sometimes you need to get more knowledge to be strategic, and that's okay. But also sometimes frontal lobe is all about self-control and impulse control. So, it is this concept of executive function. But if you look at this task on the bottom right, this is one of the tasks that we use to measure planning. And the task is simple, but when the child fills out the A's and then the B's and starts the C's, as my son Jack Jr. did when he was 5 years old, that's how you can detect if a student is thinking about how to do the task. So this very simple task is extremely powerful at uncovering if students spontaneously will use a strategy to solve a problem. The attention is all about focus. So I'm having a little trouble right now because there's a huge boat out in the marina here and he's honking his really big horn. And so it's distracting to me. But that's what we talk about when we talk about attention. And really a good way to measure attention is with this traditional test called the Stroop effect, right? Because you look at this word here, red, but you have to say yellow. And because red is so salient, it creates a wonderful environment to measure how well a student can resist distractions. Simultaneous processing is all about understanding how things go together. And this is one of the tasks that we use where we would say something like, which picture shows an arrow pointing to a circle in a square? So the child needs to understand the interrelationships of those parts. This is really important for reading comprehension, math word problems, whole language, verbal concepts. And then finally, successive processing is all about sequencing. Sequencing of sound, sequencing of motor movement, speech articulation, tying your shoe, syntax, comprehension of syntax. This is what children with dyslexia really struggle with. And you'll see the evidence of that in a few minutes. So when we think about identifying a student with a specific learning disability, what we'd like to find out is, do we have a student with strengths in some areas, a weakness in cognitive processing, and that weakness or weaknesses in cognitive processing correspond to academic weaknesses. So I'd like to render these three groups of data in this triangle. I've used this many times. Parents really love it. Teachers love it. It really helps us understand like the big picture. So to determine if a student who's gifted has a specific learning disability, we would look for very high scores, but weak scores in processing that correspond to weak academics. And we'll talk about that some more. Now, here's some research on profiles for students with dyslexia. And what I've done here is go to the literature and report the profiles on the WISC-5, the Woodcock-Johnson, ABC, and of course, PASS scales. And as you can see, this is what we get: children with dyslexia, very low successive processing. Let's go another step then. ADHD. When we think about ADHD, we know that that's an executive function failure. So a student who's gifted in ADHD, they should show the symptoms in the DSM, but they should also show the cognitive symptoms of ADHD, because there is a cognitive component, even though it's typically identified just using behaviors. So, of course, rating scales are often used to identify ADHD. These are helpful, but not sufficient. Remember, ADHD really is about Phineas Gage, the famous Phineas whose frontal lobes were so damaged by that accident. And as it relates to executive function, that's what we're talking about as we talk about ADHD, there's no formal accepted definition of executive function. In a book that I published some years ago, we found over 30 definitions of executive function. I've been studying the question of, is executive function a unitary or a multidimensional concept? Because lots of times people talk about, 30 or 40 different kinds of executive functions. And I examined this question by doing 4 studies with 10 samples, children and adults, and found very clear evidence that executive function singular is what's measured on all these different rating scales. This is a little esoteric, but it's really important, because what it means is if a student has a weakness in one area of EF on a rating scale, that's probably not going to be sufficient to say they actually have an EF problem. So if we look at how do children with ADHD perform on the WISC-5 flat profile, on the WJ, a profile like the one we just saw, on the KBC, another flat profile, but on PASS, we find a specific weakness in planning. In other words, for many children who are gifted, they could have a weakness in planning that would be related to their ADHD. So attention deficit is a bad label. It's misleading. Except if you have inattentive type of ADHD. Then it makes sense. But when we first started doing this research in the late 90s and early 2000s, we came to that same conclusion. Wait a second. it's attention deficit, but the deficit isn't in attention, except for those particular kids. It's in planning, and that's exactly what Russell Barkley and others have been saying for many years. ADHD is a failure of self-control, basically. And that makes perfect sense. So here's the key, though. We want to know if a student who has all the symptoms of ADHD has those symptoms and a failure in cognition versus they have that condition, all those symptoms but without a failure of cognition. And the implications is that different interventions would be used to manage those different people. And we do see that. We do see some children with ADHD don't have a weakness in planning, and some do. We need to know who's who. And interestingly, with autism, again, we make this diagnosis based on the DSM and all the behaviors and impairment and all that kind of stuff. But there is also a cognitive component there. And that they are, in a lot of ways, very weak in attention. It's not that they can't attend, it's that they can't shift. So it's the shifting that leads to low scores on the attention scale, on the CAS. So PASS profiles, when we put them all together, this is what it looks like. Not a lot happening for the WISC-5. WJ, not helpful. KBC, not helpful. But we do get distinctive profiles on PASS scores. And we need to know that because we do have a study with gifted children and we have PASS scores for them. All the students in this study were previously identified and in gifted programs. And when we look to see if they had variability in their PASS scores, we found about half of the times, half of the kids had a weakness or a strength. And then when we look to see, did they have a weakness and an academic weakness as well, we found about 8 to 4% of students in gifted were twice exceptional and not identified. So PASS provides us with a very powerful window into the student's ability to think along these 4 dimensions. Take care, everybody. It's really fun.